Ready for a deep dive into a life full of mystery? We're going to be exploring Marie Laveau. You know her as the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. She's got this legendary status, but how much of what we think we know is actually true and how much is, embellishment? We're cutting through all that, looking at historical accounts, stories passed down, even her pop culture cameos to get a clearer picture. And to help us with these intriguing and sometimes, I have to say, contradictory sources, we've got our expert with us, ready to shed some light on the real Marie Laveau.
One thing that I find super interesting is how her story shows how we make myths, especially around someone as captivating as Laveau.
Yeah.
It shapes how we see history.
Mm.
Like even her birth date is debated. Some people say she was practicing voodoo super young.
Yeah, it's like trying to grab smoke, right? Makes you wonder, were those embellishments on purpose or just, her living life on her own terms? But before we get totally lost, let's set the scene. Can you give us a feel for New Orleans in the early 1800s, during Laveau's time?
So picture New Orleans back then.
Yeah.
It was this vibrant mix of cultures, French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, even indigenous influences. This amazing blend of traditions where spirituality wasn't just something you did, it was everywhere. And this unique setting, it was like the perfect place for voodoo to take root.
And we're not talking about just like, a single voodoo, right? This was a New Orleans thing.
Exactly. It wasn't directly from Africa. It evolved into something totally unique. Picture Catholicism mixed with West African traditions, with some indigenous practices thrown in a true reflection of the city's diverse community.
So how did historical events, especially the Haitian Revolution just a few decades before, play into this?
The Haitian Revolution, wow, it sent shockwaves around the world, but its impact on New Orleans, huge. Imagine tons of refugees, many practicing voodoo, searching for safety in a city already bursting with spiritual traditions. This wave of new arrivals just made that tapestry we were talking about even richer.
And this is where Laveau's own family comes in, right?
Her mother, a free woman of color, she really embodied New Orleans. Think about it, African, European, and Native American roots, all part of our heritage. It's really likely their family history crossed paths with those fleeing the Haitian Revolution, shaping how Laveau saw the world and maybe even putting her on a spiritual path.
Okay, so we've got this cultural mix, this coming together of traditions, and then Marie Laveau enters the scene. But, as we've mentioned, even her birth date is unclear. So where do we even begin to separate the myth from the woman? What do we actually know about her life beyond the title Voodoo Queen? It's like Voodoo Queen almost overshadows everything else about her.
Yeah.
What else can you tell us about her, like her different roles in the community?
Okay, so get this, Laveau was a really successful hairdresser. We're talking about the wealthy elite women of New Orleans going to her.
Wow, that's a wild contrast, helping people with, spiritual guidance, but then also catering to the city's elite.
Exactly. And it wasn't that she kept those parts of her life separate. They kind of like blended together and made her even more influential.
Hold on, say more about that. How did those roles actually connect?
Think about it. As a hairdresser, she was hearing all sorts of things, right? These powerful women sharing their secrets, their worries, their vulnerabilities. She'd have had so much knowledge about the city just from those conversations.
So it's not just about hair, it's like she becomes this confidant, someone they trust with their secrets.
Totally. That insider knowledge, it would have been as valuable as any spiritual insight. And, they say Laveau was known for giving practical advice right alongside her spiritual remedies and charms. Like, she had her finger on the pulse of the city in a different way.
It makes you wonder if people were drawn to her as much for her wisdom, her everyday advice, as for her spiritual guidance. And speaking of those remedies, can you explain a little more about gris-gris and why they were important in her practice?
So gris-gris are basically charms. Little bundles of herbs, stones, different objects thought to have spiritual power. Laveau sold them to people who wanted to find love or have more money or be safe from harm. Basically using spirituality to deal with everyday problems.
It's like a physical way to connect with the spiritual world, a way to influence what happens in your life, right?
Yeah. And that really gets to the heart of why Laveau was so popular. She wasn't just about, like, otherworldly solutions. She was part of her community, dealing with real, everyday struggles alongside those spiritual needs.
And we see that in her herbalism, too, right? I mean, she was known for making remedies for all kinds of illnesses.
Absolutely. Knowing about traditional medicine would have been incredibly important back then, especially for those who didn't have other options. It shows how she offered both practical and spiritual support.
And it wasn't just through remedies or charms. She also helped her community in other ways, charity work, speaking up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Not exactly the stereotypical image of a witch that people often think of, is it?
It just goes to show how women in positions of power, especially spiritual power, get labeled and misunderstood, particularly by those outside their communities. That word witch, it's loaded, implying bad intentions and scary practices.
Yeah, it's like using that label to make people afraid of her, to like discredit her influence.
Exactly. A way to take someone's power away, make them seem scary instead of trying to understand. And that misunderstanding carries over to how we see her spiritual practices. I mean, we connect Laveau with voodoo, but remember what we were saying about how New Orleans voodoo is actually this blend of different things?
Right, like this really unique mix of traditions.
Exactly. Laveau, probably like a lot of people in her community, had her own way of practicing spirituality. She might have used parts of Catholicism along with those West African and indigenous influences we were talking about. It wasn't about sticking to strict rules. It was about finding a spiritual path that felt right for her and her community.
It's like she embodies that whole New Orleans spirit, you know? Yeah. Adapting, blending, making something new out of what's already there. And speaking of things being passed down, let's talk about Laveau's legacy, especially the mystery surrounding her daughter, also named Marie.
Oh yeah, Marie Laveau II. Now this gets really interesting. What we know from history is that Laveau's daughter might have followed in her footsteps, maybe even took over her spiritual practice.
So instead of a clean break, we've got this possibility of like a shared lineage. It just adds another layer to an already complicated story.
It really shows you how hard it is to separate what's true from what's been passed down as legend. Did they work together? Did the younger Marie step in after her mother died? We just don't know, and that mystery makes their lives even more intriguing.
It's like trying to see the individual brushstrokes in a painting. You see the whole picture, but the details are kind of blurry. Speaking of legacies, we can't forget Laveau's supposed tomb. People still go there today.
It's true, it's become this place of pilgrimage where people go to ask for her blessing, leave offerings, and mark the tomb with 3 X's for luck.
And you know, we should probably mention that might not even be her real grave. Some historians think she's buried somewhere else in the cemetery, which makes her story even more intriguing. But whether it's the exact spot or not, people still feel drawn to connect with her spirit.
It really speaks to how powerful her story is. Even with so much unknown, her legacy lives on, beyond time and historical records.
And we see that in how she pops up in pop culture. Musicians like Dr. John and the Misfits have songs about her. She's even shown up in Marvel Comics. She's more than just a local legend. She's a cultural icon. What do you think it is about Laveau that continues to fascinate people, even in all these different ways?
It's that mix of history, mystery, and you can't deny she had charisma. She represents a time and place that still captures our imagination, a world where spirituality was a part of everyday life. But even more than that, she didn't fit into a box. Laveau was a successful businesswoman, a spiritual leader, a voice for her community. She was more than just one label.
And you can see how that refusal to be put in a box comes through in all those different portrayals of her. There's no single story that can capture who she was. As we've gone through her story, we've seen conflicting accounts, missing pieces, and interpretations that probably say as much about us as they do about her. And maybe that's the most important thing we take away from our deep dive history isn't about finding all the answers. It's about asking questions, accepting what we don't know, and realizing that sometimes the best stories are the ones that leave us wanting to know more.
Exactly. It's about being okay with the unknown, appreciating the complexities, and understanding that human lives, much like Laveau's, are rarely simple or easily defined.
So as we wrap up our exploration of Marie Laveau's world, think about this. What other historical figures have we simplified in our stories? Where else can we look beyond the surface to find those fascinating complexities that make history so captivating?